This is East Africa, a land of conflict, history, and most importantly, coffee. I'll be honest, I don't know much about East Africa. I probably should have taken time to actually learn more about it before making assumptions, but anyway. What I do know is that East Africa wasn't always a region with 4 countries located in it. In fact, almost 86 years ago, it was actually... Okay, it was 4 countries, but technically it was only 2 for a decent chunk of time. Just shut up, don't question me! Anyways, East Africa. Often a region that does not receive much attention in the world, but the history of the region is just as important as any region. Being often characterized as the cradle of humanity due to the first and oldest human skeleton being found there in modern Ethiopia, also known as Lucy, which is on screen now. But today, we aren't here to discuss skeletons in human evolution. Here, we are talking about war, and how interesting it is, and how fun it can be. Fascist Italy, France, the UK, and Ethiopia. 4 countries that would meet on the fields, mountains, desert, and hills of East Africa to decide the fate of this region, and the future impact of World War II that it would play in this massive conflict. The East African Campaign, which was held from the declaration of war by Italy on the Allies to the surrender of Italy in 1943, as an oft-forgotten theater of war that actually played a greater role in the war than people can give it credit. And if the results had been different, it could be argued that the war would have gone differently. In the air, on the ground, and in the sea, the Axis and the Allies would fight vicious and often confusing conflicts to control this vital region, and access to the sea routes connecting 2 vital regions for both of the alliances. So, before we get into the actual conflict, I feel that it would be more important to do a brief overview of the history of the region since 1936. As our first bit of history, first we will be looking at the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, also known as War Crimes Light. So, it was a war, I know, shocking, especially for this time period. It was important due to the Italian forces playing a role in it, in the fact that they would get a second chance to regain glory after losing the First Italo-Ethiopian War. But it wasn't exactly fair. See, the Italians had superior artillery, they had planes, and they had tanks. Most of the Ethiopians had spears, outdated rifles, and that's about it. It was just a complete wiping of the floor for the Italians. And it honestly wasn't too surprising, but what was surprising was the fact that the Ethiopians actually fought. And they didn't just roll over and give up like the Italians hoped that they would. And this dragged the war out for almost a year. And while this wouldn't have been an issue if this was a campaign with a major world power, this was a country in Africa that, to the Europeans at least, was considered severely behind, showing an inherent weakness. In fact, if I remember correctly, I remember Pietro Badoglio, the field marshal and head of the army at that point, actually said that, no, we shouldn't go into Ethiopia because we can't support this war. But Mussolini, being the bald man he is, decided to go forward anyways. And then, after the leading commander of the operation, mustache and beard, by the way, after he was sacked by Mussolini, Pietro Badoglio came in and basically fixed up his entire situation. And by fixing it, I mean committing war crimes. But eventually they won. Il Duce declared victory over the hostile Ethiopians. This gave Mussolini, Italy, and fascism its greatest pre-war accomplishment, something that would later be dubbed the Pearl of Fascism. Italian East Africa. After the campaign had ended, the Italians decided to consolidate their territories of both Eritrea, Somalia, and their newly conquered Ethiopian lands into one large entity called Italian East Africa. So what was the AOI like during the war? There wasn't a lot of sources on the AOI during the Inter-Year Wars. Essentially what they did was they did the same exact thing that they did in their Libyan campaign, which essentially was like just pacification. I like to call it, it was a colonial state, but it was like at 50% strength Einsatzgruppen policing. Or South Africa Light? I don't know. But we're not done talking just yet before this attack, because there's actually quite a bit. See, now we have, upon Italy entering the most talked about war of all time, Italy would go into it with all the enthusiasm of a child on a sugar. Italy essentially started this war by invading on three fronts. The first one was in France in the Alpines, where they campaigned to take back traditionally Savoy crown lands, and to flex Italy's power and not make Italy look like a second junior partner to Germany. The second stage was in Libya, where a bulk of the Italian forces were. I believe it was about half a million troops were stationed in Libya to attack Egypt, conquer Egypt, and then gain access to. And then the final front we will be talking about is the topic of this video: the campaign in Italian East Africa. Before we get into discussing the conflict and the battles that would take place, I feel it also important that we need to discuss the importance of East Africa to both the Allies and the Axis, and then the forces deployed by both sides. When discussing East Africa, the importance of the region as the center of new understated. With Italy's new and formidable position on the world stage, and now having the ability to create a potential threat for Britain's control of the Mediterranean, the new colony of Italian East Africa was more important to either eliminate or neuter more than. Thus, the importance of the AOI to the Allies was that they needed to keep their supply lanes open from the British's holdings in both Indian and Pacific colonies, which would allow for the shipment of troops, equipment, ships, food, and consumer goods to the British Isles. The Axis wanted Italian East Africa to remain a thorn in the Allies' side by being a site for convoy raiding, force distraction, and other forms of tying up both Allied troops and Allied supply convoys. Initially to accomplish this task, Italy had planned to stage a force of 2 cruisers, a dozen or so destroyers, and a squadron of submarines within the ports of Assawa in Eritrea, which would allow for them to perform harassing attacks. Italy during the war. Yeah. Not the best reputation, I'll be real. I'd like to sum up the Italian army in just one simple sentence. In that, they are a stiff bundle of spaghetti noodles. In that, if you get hit by it, it'll really fucking hurt. It'll only be a one-time thing because it'll break. Suffering from a lack of equipment, both heavy and support, proper mechanization, lack of reserve equipment, improper and often outdated equipment, still in mainline service, constant infighting between generals and commanders due to the desire for glory and personal gain, an improper industry to support a long-term war, outdated and often ineffective tanks and armored cars, and oh god, it just does not end. Basically, Italy during the Second World War was in a very difficult and undesirable spot, and honestly was in no position to declare war and do the things that they did. See, unlike Germany, Italy didn't have the industry to support a massive war rearmament before they engaged in conflicts. Unlike Britain, Italy desired to have a strong and large army, but they couldn't. But the Italian struggle within their East African colony was going to be a very unique situation, as were mainly composed of colonial irregulars and local militiamen that the Italians signed up. To just give you a kind of feeling for these numbers, see, in the AOI, the Italians had a standing army at that time of about 255,950 troops. But of course, not all of those were Italian. Almost 182,000 of these troops were from Eritrea, Somalia, and then the newly conquered Ethiopia. And while it would be simple to simply label them all as one giant homogeneous unit, there were in fact multiple different groups of differing soldiers within these. See, under the homogeneous Regio Corpo Truppo Coloniale, there existed Eritrean units, which were some of the most elite and effective units within the AOI. There was Somalian units, which often served the role of bandai, or also known as small and hardy units that acted independently from the main force. And then there was also the Shifta, or Somalian people who worked as scouts. Supporting these colonial troops would in fact be 2 divisions of Italian army troops, mainly infantry. And then in addition to this, there was also spatterings of Alpini troops, some armored forces. I know that there was a grenadier unit, and then there was also camels and cavalry forces as well, being of a mix between. And even though a majority of these troops would be colonial in nature, they did have a lot of competent commanders. The leading commander would be the aforementioned Prince Amadeo, Duke of Aosta. He would go about seeing the construction of defenses, the stockpiling of food, weapons, all of that stuff. Underneath him, he also had the talented leadership of Luigi Freschi Pietro Gazzari, Guglielmo... I can't read Italian. Guglielmo Nari, and But we cannot simply just talk about the Army. We also have to talk about the Navy and the Air Force. As mentioned before, the Italians wanted to have a larger force. They wanted 2 cruisers, a fleet of destroyers, and then a fleet of subs. But due to the fact that Italy lacked a lot of natural resources such as steel, they couldn't make this. What they ended up having was about 7 destroyers, 2 of which I believe were mine layers, 5 torpedo boats, and then 8 submarines that were all based in the port. The Air Force, the backbone of all fighting forces within a modern military. With the knowledge of both the effects of aircraft in World War I, campaigns of pacification in Libya, and chemical warfare in the Italo-Ethiopian War, Italy was prime for having a modern understanding of the importance and the usages of planes. Hold up, I'm getting a call. Okay. Gotcha. Wait. What? Okay, well, folks, I have just been informed that... majority of the aircraft within the AOI were mostly obsolete, lacking spare parts and bombs, and they had 81 unserviceable planes just lying about. Like, why? What happened? Did you, crash the plane on the way there and just... And then it's just, oh, well, now we've got planes, and now we're going to put them... And well, even though the pilots that were flying these planes were all veterans of the Civil War, once again, they experienced the issue that plagued all Italian armed forces at the time, in that they lacked the support and the spare parts that were necessary to carry on a very long-term war. I like to describe the Italians in the sense as a squirrel, a very aggressive squirrel, in that if it starts running at you, it will scare the absolute living shit out of you. But if you hit him with a large enough hammer, you will get delicious squirrel jam. Alright, now that we've covered the Italian forces, we need to discuss Britain. And when you're discussing Britain, you need to discuss the political issues surrounding Britain. See, Britain and her Commonwealth were with mountains of war debt, a population and government committed to pacifism, and a slew of problems in the 30s, including the Great Depression, the Spanish Civil War, and the rise of fascism in Europe. This left Britain in a very difficult position, similar to a virgin at the Pornhub convention. Even though Britain was still the major power on the global stage, policies of dominionship within the colonies and of pushing of funds towards the Navy, along with raising wealth within the colonies, became the goal of Britain during the 20s and 30s. So basically what I wanted to put here was I wanted to do a funny haha about how the British essentially fucked this entire operation over due to complicated political meanderings, Churchill being overcritical of his general's actions, etc., etc. Basically the entire British war experience in the early war. Yet, I'm going to be honest, they had a pretty good run here. And honestly, they had lots of success when it came to this campaign. The forces were adequately trained and led. They were facing an inferior foe in terms of equipment and troop composition, had air-naval superiority, and they also had the external divisions and forces to back them up and occupy the territories that they needed. So, I'm going to be honest, pretty good job here. And this campaign went on to such as Archibald Wavell, Alan Cunningham, Godwin Austen, I forgot his first name, and Pienaar. Yep, there he is. What a gorgeous man. During this entire fight, the British had a force of about 105,000 troops, mainly colonial, and from scattered parts of the British colonies, including their African colonies, their Asian colonies. The main participants were mainly and these were essentially disseminated into about regiment size or battalion size, and then you also had the occasional division sized unit. I'm going to be totally honest, the only real wacky thing about the British forces was how they relied heavily on deception, code-breaking, and often non-fighting methods to handle this battle. I mentioned France in the beginning, so now we have to talk about France. They existed. They also contributed, but it wasn't much, I'm going to be real. It was really just de Gaulle and Churchill fighting over influence spears, so you know. The next force I want to be talking about is a shocking one in the fact that it is the Belgians of the Belgian Congo. This force, which was labeled Force Publique, it essentially was Belgian Congolese armies, probably had some of the most success throughout this entire thing, in the fact that they only had about 8,000 men at max, but they also managed to capture about 9 high-ranking Italian generals. One of them was, of course, Gezera from earlier. And they also had captured somewhere in the ballpark of 16,000 officers and colonial troops combined, which is shocking because they did better than the French, which isn't shocking. The final country I want to be talking about would be both the normal forces and rebel forces of the now conquered Ethiopia under Haile Selassie and his deposed government. Essentially, most Italians at this point were quite miffed by all the angry spaghetti boys inside of their country. While some traditional units were raised to fight alongside the British forces, the main contributions of the Ethiopian troops would be their usage of armed resistance and guerrilla tactics against the Italians within the Italian mountain ranges, and more notably the southeastern province, also called Gojam? I might be pronouncing that totally wrong. So, now that we've finally passed all of the preliminary stuff, we can finally get to the meat of this. Pizza versus British food. As you all may know, June 10th, June 10th, 1940 was the day that Mussolini declared the Hour of Fate, which was his declaration of war against Britain and France. And upon this declaration of war, the Duke d'Aosta requested from High Command the ability to essentially perform offensive operations into British and French-controlled lands. This, of course, would be in coordination with a bunch of other stuff, but the first big major thing that took place during this period of invasions for the Italians would be the invasion of British Somaliland. During this series of battles, we began to see the strength of the Italian forces within World War II. This being that they are highly capable of performing maneuvers and fighting like a modern military, despite everything I just say. Upon putting on their best pair of walking shoes, the pizza delivery process began, reaching most of their objectives early on, and facing very little resistance from British and colonial forces. All was seeming to go well, until the first major action took place, this being the Battle of Tug Argan. I probably said that wrong, but this is going to be the first example of a form. This pass was the only one that stood between the British ports of Berbera, which was the Italian goal at the point, being that it housed many ships that would wait for the evacuations of the British, and also due to the fact that it was one of the few ports actually available. I honestly don't know why I'm being so dramatic here. It was a pretty simple, normal operation. I mean, the British did manage to hold off the Italians for about 4 days, doing a fighting retreat into the pass and out of the pass, and they essentially evacuated a lot of the civilian troops and everything, and both sides were incredibly competent. Alright, so before we go on, I would like to take a moment to actually discuss in detail the nature of African warfare. So, disclosing a bit about me, I play Hoi 4. I play Hoi 4 a lot. I play Italy also quite frequently because bring victory to the spaghetti boys. Moving on from this addiction, and the reason that this script and video has taken so fucking long. It's African warfare. What the fuck is it like? Well, I hope as you kiddies know, Africa is big. Very big, in fact. So big that, if I remember correctly, by 2050, the African continent is going to be the most populated continent on this planet. African warfare. Being on a continent which, at the time of World War II, was underdeveloped in terms of infrastructure, railways, land development. Okay, well, it wasn't underdeveloped at this point. I mean, the Europeans just used it for resources. But this didn't apply everywhere. See, certain positions, such as the Cape to Cairo Railway, which connected the British Crown colonies of the Cape and the British Crown colonies of Egypt together, that was developed. There were certain portions of French North Africa that were developed. The Littoria e Balbinia, that was developed. There was areas that were developed, but a majority of it, especially in East Africa, was high. This left many regions that were often characterized by such harsh conditions such as deserts, rocky terrain, those sorts of things, open, and it required a lot of troops to be self-sufficient in a sense. Like, if you essentially had to carry a week's worth of supplies with you, and yeah, that's it. You had to carry a week's worth of supply with you, and you were never guaranteed next week's supplies. And this is also why I bring up Hoi 4, because of the fact that it is highly inaccurate in the fact that every time I play Italy, I get surrounded by British divisions. In reality, that's not possible, because in Africa, a lot of movement there takes place in the form of battalion, regiment-sized troops. It's very difficult to move large division-sized armies across that continent due to the undeveloped infrastructure and the undeveloped culture. The point I'm trying to make is the fact that African warfare is incredibly difficult, and it requires on small teams moving independently from large command, often unsupported and using only small arms to affect. And you often don't see large-scale battles due to the nature and terrain that these armies are fighting. We're going to be covering this is just kind of be like a big old wrap-up thing of like the ground campaign. Essentially, besides the invasion of British Somaliland, the Italians also managed to push into Anglo-Egypt Sudan, take a railway, and then they managed to push into Kenya, take a railway. Essentially, they just moved as far as they could with their supplies, and then cut the British and Commonwealth forces off from frontier supplies. There really isn't much to talk about these advances, because it was a very simple 100-mile advance, small fights, small skirmishes, and then you retreat or build defenses, and that's basically it. The fact that the Italians' plans for their navy didn't exactly work out how they wanted. I mean, what exactly do you expect when you're left with older ships, a limited supply of fuel, and are additionally hopelessly outnumbered? And they did take lessons from their Somali subjects and decided to become the greatest pirates ever. The plan by the Italian naval staff in East Africa was to use the forces that they had to attack British convoys while they could still float and shoot. However, the Italians were very, very bad at this. From losing half of all submarines by the end of the first month of the war, the Italians were in a very poor position. Even though you saw excellent cooperation between the which was quite rare for the time, the lack of success and the mounting losses between both the air it meant that much of the efforts of the Italian fleet were for naught. For fuck's sake, the Italian submarine Galileo Galilei got sunk by a jumped-up mail ship. I am not joking. Right, so where did we leave off? Yes. We left off January to November 1941. I wasn't there. Shockingly, I know. Alright, so before we get into all of the big battles and everything, I feel it would be very important to discuss British code-breaking efforts and the deception tactics that they used both in this campaign of the war and all throughout the war. Which, holy shit, how the fuck does anyone understand this? I only looked at the Wikipedia article, and oh my god, I must be brain dead or something, because I don't get any of it. It's just so complex, and definitely outside the scope of this video. I'm sure there's hundreds of other videos and channels and shit that have done it way better than I could probably ever do it. But regardless, I think it's important to take the efforts of this deception trickery by the British and apply it to both themselves and give themselves the time and resources necessary that they needed to ensure victory. See, the first example of superior code breaking and deception would be the early on cracking of the Italian Army and Air Force codes by Bletchley Park, allowing the British to be able to plan their attacks and missions around what the Italian forces would be doing, where they would be massing, where they would be moving, and where defenses and attacks were going to be happening. The next example of deception being used by the British, instead of taking the entire colony, they decided to go for a more deceptive way. They decided to disseminate propaganda, and then they moved to blockade this to convince both the people there and the people outside that what the British were doing was okay, and the real enemy was Funny Mustache Man. The final example of deception would be the Allied and British operations surrounding the actions of Operation Appearance. This was the eventual capturing of British Somaliland, but the efforts of Operation Camilla, a sub-operation within this larger operation, this was the star of the show. Operation Camilla. Yes, that's where we were. Alright, this operation called for the dissemination of information among British troops, Somali citizens, security leaks, I'm putting that in quotations, but you can't see that, good, luckily, from Egypt, and giving false information to the Japanese diplomat that was placed. Port said at the time. These kind of information stated that the core of the British attacks would be focused on retaking British Somaliland, and that any other attacks would be diversionary. The hopes here was that the Italians would move more men and materials out of Eritrea, where the actual attack was going to be coming, and place them within British Somaliland, effectively cutting them off from highly defensible positions. This kind of worked in a sense, but the Italians moved instead to reinforce Central Eritrea instead of pulling more troops. Out and reinforcing British Somaliland. So it was like a 50-50 success. Like, you got like half the troops. So why did I go into great detail on the activities of a bunch of people playing spy from Team Fortress 2? Well, the British saw the writing on the wall at this point, and realized that they were stretched way too thin, lacked way too much supplies, and they just simply couldn't fight in this conventional way that they were used to. So, using their large brains and charming good looks, decided to use big brain moves and lying to give them the advantage and sow confusion among their enemies. While this didn't always work for the Brits, this often would result in greater degrees of success for the Allied forces. Okay, enough big brain stuff. Back to what was I saying? Oh, yeah. Okay, so before we move on to the battles within Eritrea, I feel it's important to discuss the situation of the Italian forces at this time. It's just basically just to run away and hold defensive positions. Blah, blah, blah. Now we're going to get into fighting. Alright, so the first big battle that actually took place within this campaign, sans the invasion of British Somaliland, and would be the Battle of Agordat and Benentu. This battle began with the withdrawal of many of the Italian and colonial troops back towards the mountains and passes of Eritrea and Ethiopia, as the positions in Sudan and British Somaliland that they had taken up were considered undefendable, and also due to the string of defeats on all Italian fronts, the new stance of the Italian forces was to focus on defense, and to hold out for further reinforcements and support. During the course of the withdrawal, we would see one of the few areas of the Italian army that was held with high regard, even in terms of propaganda, the cavalry. Which, side note, it's, I think, the last charge by cavalry forces was the Italians against a Soviet position, and the Italians won. They totally won. It was highly surprising. Their cavalry force was actually not that bad, or they were just fucking mad lads. During this attack, forces under Lieutenant Amadeo Juillet, I don't speak Italian, charged Commonwealth forces, even threatening an encirclement of the forces due to how successful they were. But eventually the British got their shit together and they fought back. While they held off the Italian forces, the commander under Juillet, Renato Toga, took about 30 men with him, and then they proceeded to charge a column of Matilda tanks. If you know anything about Matilda tanks, you will know that they are not small. They are not easy to destroy even with regular anti-tank guns. So the fact that this mad lad and 30 guys decided to charge it with horses, just fucking absolute mad lad. But these brave actions by native and Italian cavalrymen helped to stall the Commonwealth forces' advances, allowing the Italian forces to set up adequate and substantial defense positions around Agordat. The following battle in and around Agordat would take about 5 days to complete. This usually consisted of the Commonwealth forces charging fortified Italian positions in hills, sharp bush, and other forms of natural defenses. And even though this battle was short, it showed the British and Commonwealth forces their willingness to march long distances. It also showed that much of the Italian forces were still well armed, well led, and often still determined to fight the British in the open. This battle would eventually be followed by the equally as important and larger Battle of Kern. And the reason that the British came to this conclusion, because when they took over the Italian positions, they found that they had 100,000 rounds of ammunition, 2,000 guns, and a couple hundred fucking grenades and shit. And so they were like, oh shit, we still got a force to fight. Whatever. Alright, now we move on to the big boy battle. The Battle of Karen. This battle. Oh boy, this battle. So upon reading more than a single source, I have learned that this was one of the bloodiest campaigns fought by the Italians in East Africa. Kern was an important position to the Italians in Eritrea, as was the main junction of a road that led to both Asawa, the provisional capital. And while the previous Battle of Agordat took place only over the course of 5 days, this Battle of Keren took almost 2 months to finish for the British, despite having air and armor superiority present over the Italians. The Italians, to counter the superiority, had some of their best units located within Keren. This included a regiment of Grenadiers, a legion of Black Shirts, and a regiment of the elite Alpini mountain divisions. Opposing these forces was a highly capable Scottish Black Watch regiment, a unit of Sikh infantry, and the support of other stotted colonial units. To sum up this lengthy and often brutal fight, I would essentially classify it as the Iwo Jima of Eritrea, in that the Italian defenders did everything in their power to hold out naturally defensive positions among the hills and mountains that surrounded Keren. This meant that repeated charges, bombings, and shellings of positions that would take place by the British, trying their best to weaken Italian forces. However, this didn't often work. Bayonet charges were often taken by counterattacking Italian forces, and the fighting was so intense that quotes even exist surrounding this battle. I know. Shocking. In the end, the fierce counterattacks by the Italians and Ascaris under them were not enough to overcome British air and land superiority. The British would capture Keren on March 27th, leading to a free and open road to conquer. Okay, so quick side note here, because the fight isn't actually super interesting. The admiral in charge of Osawa, Mario Bonetti, decided not to fight with the British and Commonwealth forces. Instead, he sought to buy time for his naval forces to conduct one last convoy raid, then scuttle their ships and block the port of Sudan and the port of Osawa, leaving them both hopefully unusable by the British in future operations. These operations concluded the campaign in Eritrea, leading to the fall of the first Italian convoy and the capturing of some of the most well-trained and strongest units in East Africa by the British. For the British, the capitulation of Eritrea meant that the forces within Italian Ethiopia were open for attack, and thus, the hopeful end of this campaign for the British and Commonwealth forces came nearer. The next important thing that we will be discussing would be the efforts of Gideon Force, which operated in the Ethiopia. When I mentioned that the British had an knack for using deception and trickery to substitute for their lower numbers and lack of equipment, this operation right here, this is the exact understanding of that tactic. Understanding that the Ethiopian province of Gojam, mentioned earlier, was not under full control of the Italians, the British, under Ord Wingate, who would later go on to lead the Chindan forces of Burma and India against the Japanese. Ord Wingate, shit, whatever. He planned on using propaganda, deception, and also the personal presence of the deposed Emperor Haile Selassie to help encourage resistance among the Ethiopian natives to help out the often small and weak forces under Wingate. Long story short, a force of around 800 men under the British was able to defeat a force of around 15,000 Italians and Ascari. Seriously, as mentioned earlier, so much to make a fucking movie on this, and I highly recommend you go and read at least the Wikipedia article on Gideon Force, because the way that the British blended politics and the army is incredible. With the collapse of Italian forces in Eritrea and the Gojam province, the colonial governor, Amadeo, the Duke d'Aosta, decided to abandon the capital of Addis Ababa, leaving behind only a scratch force to allow the escorting and removal of Italian peoples, resources, and assets. This decision to retreat into the mountains and make the final stand among them would be the final downfall of the Italian force under the Duke. These positions, while easily defendable and tough to crack, had only limited supplies of food, water, ammo, and breathing room in the caves and tunnels of the mountains. Upon removing any opposition towards the capital, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, was able to take an Italian-built limo directly into the capital city after it was captured. This was done on the 5th of May, 5 years exactly to the day in which he was ousted from power by the Italians. This started the rapid downfall of the AOI, and the moving of Italian forces from an organized fighting force that fought conventionally to a force that would fight in guerrilla campaigns to wage attrition against the Brits, allies, and Ethiopians. But I'm getting ahead of myself right here. We still have even more to go through, surprisingly. So, as was mentioned previous, with the mentioning of Operation Appearance, the British had previously deceived the Italians by appearing sus and going to vent towards Somaliland, but they managed to push the Italians even further into Eritrea. So, now much of British Somaliland was open. So what was the British Emperor to do? That's right, gents, it's tea time once again. Let's get on going and stealing those lands from the natives. Italians. And that is exactly what they did, landing nearly unopposed on the beaches and simply watching as the Italians pulled out and gave the colony back to them. That's pretty much all it is. So after the Duke d'Aosta declared living within cities to be cringe, he decided to allocate his entire force of 9,000 hardened Italian and Ascari troops to the 13,000-foot-high mountain, considered to be a rock with neither food nor water. This position, which I now just remembered was Ambi Algi, yet the issue of this position was, well, there was no way to escape it, nor receive supply from it. The British took full advantage of this, preparing themselves for a long siege, surrounding the entire mountain and stretching the Italian forces even thinner by pushing them to occupy territories that they could not afford to do. For almost 2 weeks, the Italians fought bloody battle after bloody battle, enduring artillery and air attacks. However, a stray artillery shell hit the supply of petrol that the Italians were keeping, spoiling their entire water supply and forcing them to surrender. Upon coming to terms with Alan Cunningham, the leader of the siege at the time, the Duke of Aosta marched the rest of his 5,000-strong force down the mountain and surrendered, ending the coordinated defense of it. Even though the Italian forces under the Duke of Aosta had surrendered and laid down their arms, many forces under Italian command moved to hold out for as long as possible, committing to guerrilla warfare and disruption tactics for as long as they could. I'm going to keep this real short because a lot of these holdouts are simply just that, holdouts. It is a story of undersupplied and under-equipped units holding out to the last man trying to survive and hoping to be saved by their fellows. So the first one we will be talking about was Kolkabar. This was a siege carried out by the British forces against local Italian police units and a Blackshirts militia unit, still stationed in the area surrounding Gondar. It's Gondar, not Gondor. Gondor is Lotr. Gondar is Ethiopia. This being the last stronghold held by the Italians within East Africa at the time. This was a brutal, often close-quartered series of raids and battles between Italian forces and British Commonwealth forces. The Italians managed to hold out for a little more than 3 months, thanks in hand to a very well-planned and executed raid early on in the fighting. Another highly recommended read for anyone who's interested. Also, the Italians made an armored vehicle called a hedgehog, picture for further understanding on screen now. Again, I also highly recommend reading about this topic. It's interesting as fuck, and definitely also. So the next one we're going to be talking about is the Siege of São. Now, this battle was even more unique in the fact that the majority of this battle was fought between the forces of the Belgian Congo and the Italians. This battle, of course, being the largest role of the Belgians in this campaign during this battle. With only a force of about 2,500 troops during the whole campaign, the Belgians used shoot-and-scoot tactics, not my words, their literal words when they described it, to fool Italian forces into thinking that they had more troops than they initially did. Even though the Italians held strong positions and had the potential to hold out due to greater leadership and adequate supplies, the Belgian forces had the element of time and greater supply, and eventually managed to dislodge the Italian forces, ending the siege. This resulted in the capture of two of the last high-ranking Italian generals, General Gazzari and General Di Simone. Okay, so when I look up this topic, all I got was the Battle of Gondor in Lord of the Rings. Nah, I'm just kidding. Why would I want to read that book? No, you get out of here, Gandalf! Okay, back to Italy. So, this was the final stand of the Italian forces, and oh boy was it felt. Having a force of 40,000 troops of varying quality, something in the area of around 70 artillery and anti-air pieces, the Italian forces were determined to hold this fortress town from the plutocratic west. And the town fell in 2 weeks after the passes leading towards the town were captured, and the outskirts of the city were captured by the forces of an armored car regiment. Yeah, not a great reputation, I guess. But I mean, I don't blame them. Like, fuck, they were the last force within Italian East Africa, and we're probably done with this fight at this point. Thus, ending the conflict in East Africa. And I could fucking stop writing this script. See, there's a reason I wanted to write this script. The reason that I wanted to write this script to make this video is that this campaign is often forgotten by many historians, and is often non-existent among even average or casual historians of history. Wow, that doesn't make any fucking sense. I should know, though, because I'm one of them. I didn't know anything about this. But reading more about this has made me realize that the conflicts in the AoE are often overlooked more than the conflicts happening in North Africa, which themselves are overlooked a lot. This issue is even more exacerbated due to the lack of proper news coverage, the overshadowing of defeats in Greece and Egypt, the invasion of Russia later on, and the continued bombing of Britain. This campaign should simply not be forgotten, as the forces, commanders, tactics, and outcomes have a larger overarching feature of the war. If the British had been defeated by the forces in the Italian East Africa, who would know what this had done for the convoys heading from India, the Pacific, or South Africa? If the British had been soundly defeated, would the Italians have enough leverage to regroup and potentially conquer Anglo-Egypt Sudan? Regardless of all of the things, it's just, Mussolini. Potentially, could they have secured the Suez Canal, controlled the Red Sea, and all the other naval routes that would help connect Europe to Asia easily?
These hypotheticals could go even further, and honestly, they go way beyond the scope of this video. Yet, looking beyond the hypotheticals of this conflict, what would happen in this campaign was a war that was characterized by both brutal fighting and gentlemanly codes of conduct. The fates of many native Africans were changed by simply being involved in this campaign, fighting for their respective sides for the lofty goals of European powers. This campaign would go on to help shape and mold the careers of many British generals and commanders, a majority of whom would go on to fight in the North African campaign later on. This campaign was more important than many think, and I believe it is important to help show the world the forgotten and often misunderstood aspects of history that are found within this global conflict. Wars are often summarized to make its understanding easier for casual viewers. Wars are often summarized to make its understanding easier for casual viewers, and for the public to understand. But war ends just as equally.